Well, good evening and welcome to tonight's discussion. This is Racial Justice and the Witness of the Black Church. This webinar is sponsored by Union Baptist Church here in Durham, North Carolina. My name is Prince Rainey Rivers and I have the pleasure of serving as senior pastor there. I'll be the moderator tonight. We have an incredibly gifted and informed group of panelists tonight, and some are pastors, some are practitioners and preachers, and some are academicians, but each one of them is committed to the church and to the vision of racial justice. Before I introduce each of the panelists, let me say something about what we're doing tonight and why we're doing it. So today is June 19th, and what makes today special from a historical perspective is that on June 19th, 1865, the news was delivered in Galveston, Texas, that Abraham Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation and the enslaved Africans were free. Now, keep in mind, that was 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation had gone into effect in 1863. Some have called Juneteenth the oldest nationally celebrated commemoration of the ending of slavery in the United States. But one thing we can say for sure is that the ending of slavery was a matter of justice. It's a matter of justice. And even slaveholders like Thomas Jefferson knew this. Listen to an excerpt of one of his writings from a piece called The Notes on the State of Virginia. He said, and I quote, "And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God." So he saw freedom as a gift of God, that they are not to be violated, but by his wrath, by God's wrath. He said, "Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever, and that considering the numbers, the nature, and natural means only, a revolution of the wheel of fortune, an exchange of situation is among possible events, that it may become probable by supernatural interference." And I shared that quote because Thomas Jefferson, who was really more of a deist than a Christian, understood that God is a God of justice. We know that justice has always been at the heart of the theology of the Black church. And today, amidst all the social and political uprising in our country and our world, we want to deal with this issue of justice. Now, let me say from the beginning that justice is a broad topic, covers many issues, including gender, including class, including economics, including health, just to name a few. Our time is limited tonight, and because of the recent murders of Rayshard Brooks and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, we're going to focus tonight on racial justice and the witness of the Black church. What does faith have to say about racial injustice? What is the church called to do now? And I'm glad to introduce to you tonight the people who are going to help us talk about these issues. We have 5 panelists with us tonight. We have the Reverend Melanie Jones, who is an instructor of ethics, theology, and culture, and the director of womanist leadership at Union Presbyterian Seminary. She's also the co-curator of #Millennial Womanism digital forum and the co-founder of the Millennial Womanism Project. We also have Dr. Nicole Massey Martin, who is with the American Bible Society. She's the executive director of trauma and healing. We have Dr. Patrick Smith, the Associate Research Professor of Theological Ethics and Bioethics at Duke Divinity School. The Reverend William Lamar IV, Senior Pastor at Metropolitan AME Church in Washington, D.C., a podcaster and activist. We also have Dr. Kevin Cosby, Senior Pastor of the St. Stephen's Church in Louisville, Kentucky, the largest Black church in Kentucky, activist and pastor and president of Simmons College as well. Welcome to each of you. Thank you for being here. Let me begin with a question, and we'll just sort of go around and ask everyone to take a turn addressing this issue. So as a Christian pastor, leader, or academician, whatever place you stand in, what is your view of justice? We hear the word so often, and usually it's referring to the legal system. Give us, who are listening tonight, your view of justice. We can start with Dr. Martin, if you don't mind.
Oh, I was holding my breath like, don't start with me, I want to hear. So I think the The easiest understanding of justice, first of all, is to understand that justice is a biblical term. It's a biblical reality. The idea of justice is simply to make things right. And so when we say, for example, in scripture that God is just, God is one who makes things right. But there's not just the justice of God who makes things right, but there's the calling upon our lives to make things right. So when we are called to do justice or to act justly, we're called to make it right. So for me, the core definition of justice has to be rooted in scripture, has to be rooted in the personhood of God, but it's also rooted in our relationships. So when we take justice and we think about racial justice, we're talking about how do we make things right, and that requires owning what's been wrong, especially what's been wrong related to African Americans, related to how racialization has shifted the whole world to see darkness as the lower part of the totem pole and whiteness at the top. So I could go on, but I think for me, the core is that justice is a biblical term. It's rooted in God, it's relational, and it's about making things right.
Thank you. That's great. That's great. You want to jump in, Reverend Lamar?
Yes, thank you again for the opportunity. So I think of two things immediately. I think about the abundance of God. So the creation narrative, as we have it from the Hebrew people and Afro-Asiatic people, is understanding that God is a God of abundance and not a God of scarcity. And God's abundance is meant to be shared amongst all of the families of humankind. So I think in terms of abundance, and I also think in terms of flourishing. So when you read the works, the prophetic corpus, God, through the prophets, rails against those who hoard God's abundance and who eclipse or limit human flourishing for any way. And God is clear about the hatred of this. So two things, and I'll stop. Often in scripture, in the Hebrew Bible, the word that is translated is as righteousness could also be translated as justice. But interpreters chose to, and the same thing in the white evangelical imaginary that afflicts the Black church as well as the white church, righteousness is construed as something pious and individualistic. Justice is more communal, and we shy away from the communal. And so God's justice is about God's abundance and God's intent, not only of human flourishing, but in all of creation flourishing together. And where that does not exist, we have theological trouble, anthropological trouble, sociological trouble.
Thank you. And we'll come back to those consequences because that's important. So we've got this idea that justice is biblical, it's rooted in scripture, and that it's communal, it's corporate. Dr. Cosby, how would you speak to justice?
I think that, first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel and taking so many notes from my colleagues, just some brilliant insights that they've already given us. But I think that when you talk about justice, there's two Hebrew words for justice. One is sadiqwa and one is misfat. Misfat has to do with the equal allocation of resources so that all of God's people have access to opportunity. Misfat, I think, is best seen and best displayed in the Lord's Prayer when Jesus says, give not me daily bread, but give us this day our daily bread. So that is what, as my brother said, that's the communal part in terms of a just distribution of resources and opportunities instead of what you see now, the total maldistribution and calcification of resources and wealth in the hands of whites. So that's one aspect of justice, and that is sadiqwa. But when you're talking about Black justice, you're not talking about sadiqwa. You're talking about misfat. What I just defined was misfat. When you talk about Black justice, you're talking about sadiqwa, which is more specific. For example, if you want to know the difference between sadiqwa and misfat, then consider the story of Zacchaeus in Luke 19. That is a justice story where Jesus defines repentance and salvation with reparations, repairing people. First of all, Zacchaeus said this: if I have defrauded, he says, a half of my goods I will give to the poor. That is misfot, sharing resources in a general way. And then he said, if I have defrauded anyone, I will restore them fourfold. That is sadiqwa. And Black people are not only deserving of misfot, which means to live in a just society, but because of 246 years of unpaid labor, plus another 100 plus years of semi-slavery, sharecropping, Jim Crow, and all these other isms that affected Black people, we are also deserved of some specific repair that no other group in America is deserving of.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great insight. It seemed to be building on each other. Reverend Jones, help us with this notion of justice.
Thank you again for having me, and such a pleasure to be here with such esteemed colleagues. When I think about justice, just as the panelists have already shared, it is a biblical term that is rooted in a prophetic tradition. When Micah 6:8 says, to do justice, you have shown me, O Lord, what it is to do justice, right? To love mercifully and to walk humbly, that God never requires something from us that God doesn't already show us. So God's justice is something that God desires that we live into. But I'm often reminded of justice as a prophetic and a biblical term always relates to relational or kind of nation ordering in terms of how societies are formed and their interactions. And when I think about the term justice in America as a country that has marked its kind of democratic project as that which is signed by liberty and justice for all, and then we recall a history such as Juneteenth history where there has not been liberty and justice for all, it is really not a question of what justice is, but what justice is not, right? And we are living more than 400 years in the wake of not experiencing the totality of justice in a nation that has prized itself on acting justly. In addition to that, I draw from Dr. Cornel West's term, his phrase, justice is what love looks like in public. And not a sense that this is just some kind of interiority or public face of justice, but that love and justice must always happen in tandem. And we must think about ordering our communities, how we love one another, right? As this kind of biblical principle often applies and also applies to what it means to do justice.
Thank you. Thank you. So you've introduced the notion of love, and we'll come back to that as well as we think about what it means for us as the witness of the Black church. Dr. Smith, would you weigh in on this?
Yes, absolutely. My dad was a pastor for a number of years. After preachers have preached and other people have made astute remarks, he would often get up and just say ditto, ditto, ditto. And so I guess I should say ditto, 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 ditto. Because I am in full agreement with all of what my esteemed colleagues have said in this regard. And I would also just want to add just kind of a different way of glossing over some of the points that have already been made. You know, Dr. Lamar raised this issue of the way righteousness and justice coming from the same biblical word group and the choice of translators and the connotations that have. You know, I'm thinking about something like 2 Corinthians 5:16 through 21, when it talks about being ministers of reconciliation. There are some churches, some spaces that only look at that as some type of, you know, just personal evangelism, so to speak. But the context bears that out, that this is not only kind of a vertical, you know, kind of connection with God, but a horizontal ordering of all of God's good creation in terms of a cosmic, with dealing with issues of the environment and questions of environmental racism come up as well here, interpersonal, institutional life, and a full economic exchange, such that when that verse talks about that we may become some translations say the righteousness of God, it is very appropriate to say that we may become the justice of God, embodying that in a lived, in a real embodied way. One of the other things that I would build off of as well, the way it is, the Hebrew kind of context has helped shape this idea of justice, this kind of guiding vision for me of the notion of shalom. It's often translated kind of this idea of peace, but I think it goes back again to something that's already been said about flourishing and well-being, this kind of right ordering again, which means that this gives us a moral vision for which we should strive. And so for me, justice cannot be merely an abstract kind of philosophical concept or philosophical construct. That justice, at least as it's informed by Christian tradition, always has to be concrete and particular. So that if you have a moral vision that the prophets have given to us in the prophetic literature, here's the vision, and then we look to see where we start, where we begin, the brokenness of the situation we find ourselves, and then we develop concrete steps of justice to get from where we are to the moral vision of where we're trying to go. So in that sense, it kind of rules out a kind of merely contemplative, abstract philosophical notion of justice, but it has to be something that is certainly very concrete and material and particular. And the last thing I'll just say very quickly here is that the biblical tradition does allow for, in this context of justice, what some would call a principle of redress, right? Which has already been said again. And so I think that this is part of our conversation when we think about racial injustice in this country, and the Christian church and the Christian resources that are part of that tradition certainly hold up and prop up and emphasize this imperative of a principle of redress in our relations.
Yeah. So let's stay with that for a moment. And I see a lot of heads nodding. What does that look like? What does that mean to you when you think about principle of redress? We're in this capitalist society, quasi-capitalist, I guess, given how much corporations are propped up by the government and bailed out. But given the world in which we live and the culture and the economic realities in which that surround us, what does redress mean to you? How do you think about that practically? Because I'm sure if you mention it, you're going to get some looks like, okay, yeah, that's nice. That's a nice thing to talk about. But what does that look like? What could it look like? And this is a question to anybody who may have given this some thought. And we're all friends, so I need y'all to jump in, and just unmute yourself, Dr. Cosby. We want to hear what you're saying. Yeah.
Okay. I would say that my colleague from Duke University also has a colleague, and that is William Sandy Darity, who has just written I think, a reparations manifesto. It said that Dr. King never went anywhere without having his Bible and a copy of Jesus and the Disinherited, Howard Thurman, in his valise. And I think from this point on, I will never go anywhere without my Bible and Dr. Darity's book, From Here to Equality. And he outlines a plan for real reparations to the American descendants of slavery. Our wealth positionality has not moved since 1865. And the primary way in which you measure the health of an individual, a family, and a community is based on wealth. Black people have had their wealth plundered. And justice means a plan of reparations that makes, or as someone said, makes things right, that repairs Black America. And it must be specific, I think, to the American descendants of slavery, Jim and Jane Crow people. So I think that anytime you have whites who are 60% of the population controlling 90% of the wealth, you got problems. White America hates us because we're Black, but they mistreat us because we're poor. And as long as we have no wealth, we will continue to be the victims of white supremacy, and we will continue to be mistreated.
Dr. Cosby, and I do want others to weigh in on this. Actually, I came across a report that Darity put out as part of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity. This was back in 2018. This report came out, and this is what he said about the racial wealth gap. So this supports what Dr. Cosby just said. He said, "We challenge the conventional set of claims that are made about the racial wealth gap in the United States. We contend that the cause of the gap must be found in the structural characteristics of the American economy, heavily infused at every point with both an inheritance of racism and the ongoing authority of white supremacy. He said, Blacks cannot close the racial wealth gap by changing individual behavior. In other words, just saving more. If the structural sources of racial inequality remain unchanged. For the gap to be closed, America must undergo a vast social transformation produced by the adoption of bold national policies that will forge a way forward by addressing finally the long-standing consequences of slavery, the Jim Crow years that followed, and ongoing racism and discrimination that exist in our society today. Who else wants to weigh in on this notion of, I guess now we're talking about racial inequality and how justice fits into that?
I think, Prince, that I might consider using different language. When when we talk about racial justice, I think about what Du Bois wrote. How does it feel to be a problem, right? So to talk about racial justice often means, you can't really, the conversation we're really having is one around white supremacy, the effects of white supremacy. And because we often soften our language so as to not offend, and I don't want to offend, but you really can't get at the thing until you call the thing what it is. When we talk about white supremacy, we talk about the settler colonial impulse, which was funded theologically. So this is an issue that I have, that how deeply intertwined the church is with this whole regime economically and sociopolitically, that it was the church that told the Portuguese, the Catholic Church, that when you come upon the natives and the Africans that you were enlisting in the slave trade, they don't have souls. That their souls belong to God, their bodies belong to you, therefore you can do whatever you want to with them. And that same space of controlling bodies, dislocating bodies, extracting profit from labor, taking land, even, well, I see gentrification in a city like DC as the unbroken conquest and removal of unworthy bodies from spaces. And so I was watching a clip with Martin King being interviewed by Sander Van Oker, and he talked about how during the same period of Reconstruction, America was bringing European labor, European immigrants, and giving them land in the West and Midwest, giving them the expertise to farm. That we gave land, we gave reparations rather to the Japanese, but no redress for the natives, no redress for Africans. And I agree with Dr. Cosby that we have to push this economically, but in order to do that, you have to have theological momentum from the communities of faith in the Black church that are resistant, as well as the broader theological community. So I'll stop there.
And I know that since I raised this, and this is why I think it's so important to identify those tropes or themes, right, that show up in Christian tradition, because it's already right there. I mean, when we were taught as kids, when we break things, we try to fix it, we try to make it right. The basic idea is very straightforward from an ethical perspective. The question is the political will to be able to move forward, and also the moral imagination to envision a new way of doing life together with respect to some of these particular questions, right? So there's the larger economic aspect of all of this that I think is absolutely important that we have to wrestle with. I mean, and the question is just when we look at our national budget, right? There's a whole lot of money coming in. The question becomes, where are we allocating those dollars in many ways, which identifies where our values are. But even it can be on a local level, something straightforward. I think I remember hearing maybe Brian Stevenson say a while back, it's like, well, thinking about the difficulty with respect to with what needed to happen with regard to passing the Voting Rights Act, so on and so forth. Why not just automatically register, African Americans to vote when they turn 18, right? I mean, that's not all of it, but little things in terms of just redressing those wrongs from the past going forward, so that we can have equity, not merely just equality of opportunity, because you can't, until we deal with some of these other issues, we'll never be able to have equality of opportunity in that respect.
Yeah, when you talk about kind of redressing the wrongs, part of what both excites and grieves me, specifically about this day, about Juneteenth, is both the perceived distance, oh, that was so far away, that was so long ago, and the lack of knowledge. I mean, I know Black people who are just figuring out what Juneteenth was all about. But if we go back to that time, this illusion of emancipation wasn't real emancipation. Where do you go? How do you live? What kind of job do you have? I've been today especially doing a lot of thinking about how it must have felt for my ancestors. We're talking about my great grandparents. This is not that far away. I have a picture of my great grandparents, my great grandparents, just after emancipation. They took, one of those 1800 pictures where nobody smiles. And it just, I look at that picture and I have this wide range of emotion, joy and grief at the same time. And part of this making right, I think when white people hear reparations, they think taking from me what I've earned, but it lacks the bigger picture. It lacks this sense of communal obligation. It lacks the fact that we're talking about a stolen people living on a stolen land. And it lacks this continuity that it wasn't just about reparations from slavery. It's reparations after Tulsa and after the demolition of Black Wall Street. It's reparations after constantly being denied opportunity and access and jobs and education. So there is a ripple effect. And Patrick, to your point, I think there is a way to start with small steps, but I get nervous about it. I get nervous about the small steps because I do know that some people will say, okay, we'll get a scholarship to college. Won't that be enough? And I don't know what enough looks like after 400 years. I don't know. I mean, what's enough? There's so much loss over all this time, so much that needs to be restored, so much that's been broken internally and externally and communally. It can feel overwhelming, but we've got to ask these questions now.
Wow. Yeah, this is rich.
I think I want to add to that and just really kind of put some landscape on what we're talking about. When I think about the Institute for Policy Studies, their 2019 report on enriching the 1% and how it has widened the racial wealth gap. And they have revealed to us that the wealth of white median families is $146,000, which marks a 30% increase in the last 30 years. But yet Latinx and Black households still persist at the poverty level, so much so that the wealth of Black median families has fared the worst in the last 33 years, plummeting to a record low of 12,000. And the projections is that Black median families on the path towards wealth will have zero wealth by 2082. I think that frames for us that redress looks, not only is it important for us to think about it in terms of repentance, that America needs to repent, right, for its sin of forming and maintaining and sustaining a racialized system that is designed to keep Black people as inferior, but it also has to repair the damage that it has fostered and reconcile with the larger world. And this time last year, I remember when Ta-Nehisi Coates and Danny Glover went to the congressional committee and raised the case for reparations yet again, saying, wait a minute, for a nation that has quote unquote apologized for its tragic racial history only in 2009, it only is living up to that in word, but certainly not in deed if reparations are not a part of that conversation.
Thank you. I mean, there's so much in this. We could probably keep going on this one topic, and we may come back to it, but I really appreciate what you're saying. Someone is asking about the links to some of these reports, and we'll probably collect them from you guys later and then share them with the audience. But let me talk a little bit about, or ask you a question about the church. So the other half of this topic is the witness of the Black church. And when you think about just the history that we've just named and the structural realities that we've just described, and think about the prophetic witness of the Black church, which is kind of where many of you started in your understanding of justice. Where do you think we are getting it right? What have we missed? And I know we've missed a lot, but you know, what are we called to do in this moment as the Black church? What are you seeing? What do you like? What is grieving you? What's giving you hope?
Well, let me start. I think that I am glad that this new generation of activists, to some degree, didn't go to church. I'm glad that because they would have been de-radicalized had they attended the church of the 90s, the 80s, the 90s, and the first part of the 21st century. They would have been baptized into an unhealthy prosperity gospel that focused on pietism and not social justice.
And just for the audience out there, just in a sentence, give them what pietism is.
Pietism focuses on a vertical relationship with God exclusively, without regards to the horizontal and social dimension of the gospel, the social demands of the gospel.
Gotcha.
And it's not even a healthy pietism. It was primarily just greed. And so I'm glad. I think this is a repudiation of the health, wealth, and prosperity gospel of the 90s. And I think that the church has got to reassess and speak, I think, very forthrightly in its condemnation of any gospel that does not make justice and Black justice demands central. If you steal my car on Monday and you get saved on Tuesday and you're still driving my car on Wednesday, you were not saved on Tuesday. The sign that you have been saved on Tuesday is not only do you return my car, but you return my car with a full tank of gas and you make sure my car has been washed. That is justice. And I think that we have to speak very prophetically to these puppet preachers and to how the white church has engaged in an unholy wedlock with white racistic culture. So I think that the Black church must find its heroes and heroines again. I think we must embrace the theology of Denmark Vesey and Gabriel Prosser and Nat Turner and David Walker and Harriet Tubman and Rosa Parks and Martin King. And you know, Jesse Jackson, I'll close with this, says the problem with the Black church, he said this once a while back, that we have pictures of Martin King in the vestibule, and we've got a picture of Malcolm X in the pastor's study, but we got the theology of Franklin Graham in the pulpit.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. And the story, the metaphor of salvation and the stealing the car is beautifully profound and simple enough for everyone to get that how justice and salvation are inextricably tied together. Reverend Lamar, were you going to?
Yeah, I want to jump in. I want to thank Dr. Cosby for helping us and for opening space. So I grew up, most of you grew up, I think, hearing the same question at the end of a sermon. If you died tonight, where would you go? Now, I'm on a one-man mission to take the ordination of every preacher who asked that question away. Jesus never asked anybody that question. He would not have understood that question. That question portrays the theological deficiency of the Black church. we have stripped body from soul. And when you strip body from soul, when you take away the fact that human flesh has been made holy in the incarnation, all human flesh has been made holy, we concentrate on the eternal address of souls to the detriment of understanding the work that we're supposed to do for human beings and human bodies in this space. And one of the things I really think is, I think we overblow the Black church's prophetic stance. When you think about Vernon Johns in the church before King got there, Vernon Johns caught hell from those middle-class Negroes, trying to move them economically and politically, and so did King. Everybody that loved kings today talk about how much they love him. Negroes are scared to talk about capitalism, scared to talk about reordering society around a vision of possessions and human flourishing that is decoupled from plutocracy and kleptocracy. So let's go back to this question about the Black church. I agree with Dr. Cosby. The people who started the Black Lives Matter movement, I've been working with them today. They were gay and lesbian brothers and sisters. They were transgender. The church would not open doors for them, would not receive or affirm their humanity. And they went and did the church's work away from the church because we were so busy judging them that we could not see the Jesus in their ministry and in their movements. And so what it is incumbent upon us to do, I think, and Jeremiah Wright talks about this, decouple the Black church's values from middle-class American values and return to the theologies that Dr. Cosby mentioned, because it's poisonous, man, it's poisonous. And we have abandoned the needs of the Black masses. Black middle-class preachers like me, who have been educated, we have abandoned the Black masses. We do not listen to them, we devalue them, and they will abandon us. I'm just convinced if we are not listening to the Black masses and going in their direction, the church ought not survive.
Say it, man.
Yeah, one of the things that's actually been very encouraging for me has been seeing some Black churches that were not traditionally prophetic. I mean, let's not forget that there were large groups of Black churches during the time of King that did not embrace the civil rights movement, that did feel this was a social move and it's not biblical. And some of those strains still continue today. But I've actually been quite encouraged to see, at least for some pastors who did kind of lean more on the pietistic side, I feel like their eyes are being opened in some way. Yes, this is a time for white Americans to kind of understand and accept and lament and look at history, but for a lot of Black pastors and the Black Americans, it's that time as well. One of the most pivotal moments for me was, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, watching a Black pastor online break down and cry over the idea that for years he has not done justice to his congregation because he has not been as forthright about the prophetic role of the pulpit, about the, as Dr. Lamar said, the needs of the Black middle class. He had abandoned the voice of the activists and kind of categorized them as social and other. And he wept. He wept publicly and said, I feel like all these years, I haven't done my best for my congregation. That actually gives me hope. And I hope and pray that there are some of those pastors like that listening tonight, because I think they traditionally heard a Pastor Cosby, they heard you, Pastor Rivers, they heard a Pastor Lamar, and they would say, oh, that's so not me. And so they kind of go on the opposite spectrum and sleepily walk themselves into a Franklin Graham. But being able to be in moments like this is part of the joy of this moment of awakening, that there is a shaking happening even in the Black church, where Black pastors are having to re-identify and reclaim a sense of prophetic identity. When you're sitting on the screen, you have both bondage and liberty. I don't have to look for the amens. I can actually say what I think. So I think that has definitely given me some hope.
That's great. That's great. Anybody else weigh in on that? These are such important issues. We come to church and listen to preaching every week. It shapes our hearts and shapes our minds.
Well, Reverend Jones.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think from a theological standpoint, the Black church its formation, right, as an invisible institution in the hush harbors and brush harbors that sought or was able to kind of steal away in order to meet the divine. And that embrace the clearing and this wilderness motif. I am thinking about our kind of theological designations, even as Black liberationists, of this sense that that God will deliver us, and that takes the onus off of us in order to work out our own salvation. And I'm drawing back to Dolores Williams, her work in Sisters in the Wilderness, that reminds us that our Juneteenth moments were few and far between when freedom was on the other side of the next day, right? Most of our experiences, particularly in these times, has been a long road to freedom. And as a result, we have to think about how do we survive and even thrive in the midst of unfavorable conditions, and use the tools and resources that God has given us in order to, again, work out our own soul salvation.
And just to chime in here, I think it was years ago, I remember reading Cornel West's little essay. I think it was Subversive Joy and Revolutionary Christianity, Revolutionary Joy in Black Christianity. I'm messing up the title here, but he talks about three notions of freedom. And this is really to the point in terms of the prophetic aspect of the Black church, and where the church has maybe gotten off track, at least certain quadrants of the church. But he talks about these three kinds of freedoms. I think it's like an existential freedom, which is just a fancy way of talking about the freedom to be who we are in terms of our cultural aesthetic and all that brings to the table, and drawing from those resources from that tradition, forming our voice. And then there's a notion of social freedom. And he talks about that not being necessarily or not only a kind of political struggle, but a kind of social freedom with respect to how we think about solidarity. So going back to Reverend Lamar's point about this notion of the Black masses, right? That becomes very important. Don't give me Michael Jordan, Oprah Winfrey, Barack Obama. The litmus test is going to be the Black masses, right? So a kind of freedom that can bring together a solidarity where white supremacy does not seek to divide, right, Blacks by rewarding them with a kind of a racialized capitalistic consequences, right, to forget about the Black masses. And then he talks about an eschatological freedom, right? And for those who are in the church and theology, we talk about that as a freedom that brings together this sense of the vision of what is to come. It's not a pie in the sky, just rest on our laurels and just hope that things are going to work out, but it's a kind of freedom that gives a kind of theological hope, even if not a political hope, right? A kind of theological hope that we have settled the question of death, right? And it's an identification not only with the resurrected Jesus, but also a crucified Jesus who bears our pains, our sorrows, our suffering, a deep identification, right, with this Jesus, but one who has overcome. And so suffering in that sense is always embodied, but a persevering suffering that gets to an end, and not merely an abstract philosophical way of reflecting on something as well. So I think that prophetic aspect of the kind of freedom that the Black church needs, that it has had, many churches do have, and other churches are recovering, becomes really important for the ability for the Black church to bear witness in today's world in this moment.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And you know, one of the things that came up over the course of, you know, your remarks, this notion of, you know, working with activists and activists who didn't come up in the church, but they're doing the work. And so on some level, the theological starting point may be different for the church and where some of these activists are. How do you think about that in terms of the work of the church and the social and political issues that affect all Black folks, you know, regardless of their theological vantage point, and the church thinking about engaging people and organizations and movements and networks outside of the Christian tradition as we are familiar with it in terms of what we might call traditional Black church. where do you see it working? Do you do it? How do you do it? Why do you do it? What's the tension there, if there is a tension? You know, so I just thinking about Reverend Lamar, you were talking about you were working with, you know, BLM today. And I don't know much about the chapter in DC, and maybe, you know, you can address that if you want to, but what is that like? How are you received as a pastor? What are the challenges you face? What's different about that versus working with your own, you know, faith traditions?
Yeah, I think that, you know, I think a lot of this goes back to the fact that the church loves to worship Jesus, but it doesn't follow Jesus, right? So we have, and Jesus never asked to be worshiped. Jesus wanted followers, and a lot has been written and said about that. So when you talk about the way that Jesus moved amongst people, there was no dogmatic litmus test before he talked to the Samaritan woman. There's no dogmatic litmus test when he moved around. And I think that we have replaced fidelity to dogma with fidelity to Jesus. So what I think about is this: these are human beings whom the church has marginalized. It is my job not to ask them any questions about coming to church, are you saved, none of that stuff. My job is to listen to them and to build relationships of trust. And when I have done that, I've been able, once they see that Lamar is not judging us, he ain't beating us over the head with no Bible, he's not trying to get us to do, you know, say some Pauline prayer and be zapped up in the rapture, any of that kind of stuff. What he's trying to do is to make himself a friend and to serve alongside. And that has opened doors for us to serve. And to, you know, I think about, you know, Emmanuel 9, we observed the 5-year observance of that massacre. Well, 200 years prior, Emmanuel Church had been destroyed by the white racists in Charleston because Denmark Vesey hatched his insurrection in the basement of Mother Emmanuel Church in a class meeting. And of course, you know, somebody wasn't told, because that kind of happens. But what happened is when they burned the church down, Morris Brown was the pastor. Morris Brown, South Carolina made really the gathering of blacks for religious purposes illegal. Morris Brown ran to Philadelphia to Richard Allen. Richard Allen brought him into his home, groomed him, and made him the second bishop of the AME Church. He made the second bishop of the AME Church a radical. He opened his doors, and he knew by bringing Morris Brown into his house, the people who were looking for him, he put his whole family in jeopardy. We no longer practice that, what Dennis Dickerson calls the ministry of risk, taking a risk to welcome those who are inaugurating alongside God, God's new creation. God didn't, the writer in John, Revelation 21 doesn't say, I come to bring a renewed, an improved, I've come for new heaven, new earth. And where I am right now, and I'll stop here. If we read what our ancestors left us, what Du Bois left us, what Turner left us, what King left us, what Malcolm left us, they pretty much told us that you cannot fix America. America, no more bandages. It must be reimagined and rebuilt. The South Africans post-apartheid, they created a new constitution. I just think we got to stop wasting energy thinking that we can improve this house that's on fire. Let's do the work of imagining something different. Mm-hmm. And that's what I do alongside them. Try to, at least.
So it sounds like, I mean, you're talking about really a radically different way of thinking about hospitality. And so often the church sees itself as the host, but you're going out there as the guest.
Yes, sir.
How can I be with you in the journey? Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
I like to I like to posit that we are dealing with, and it's very nuanced. I think we're dealing with 3 streams of activism,
okay,
that we often make confluent, but they have many commonalities, but they have many dissimilarities. And to me, the 3, and I'm engaged with an activist group that is called ADOS, the American Descendants of Slavery. So you've got three groups that are basically articulating a vision of where the Black community should be at. You have the traditional Pan-Africanist, the Hotep, those who have been influenced by John Henry Clark, Wade Nobles, the Afrocentrist, Malefi Asante. You have that stream, and you have young people who are Hotep, Pan-Africanist, who perhaps have not gotten the same notoriety maybe as Black Lives Matters. So you have them, then you have another stream, in which is Black Lives Matters, which tends to be more intersectional. And then you have ADOS, the American Descendants of Slavery. And ADOS is Black intersectional. It's not intersectional with whites or with feminists. It's only Black intersectionality that makes our justice claim as descendants of slaves and Jim and Jane Crow people the most consequential thing. So for ADOS, which I am a strong participant in and actively involved in, while we have in our movement LGBTQ and atheist and theist, what for us is the most consequential thing is our Blackness, and not our color, not our sexual orientation, but our lineage. So it's a lineage movement that traces our ancestry back to the sons and back to slavery, which is the basis of our justice claim. So I think that it's very important that we recognize that while they're painting the streets of Washington, D.C., Black Lives Matters, and while I affirm Black Lives Matters, that there also are other visions of where the Black community should be and what we should be doing.
And right, and ADOS, A-D-A-O, A-D-O. Right.
American Descendants of Slavery.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So we've talked a little bit about working, and I didn't want to cut anybody off. Everybody.
Yeah, I think Reverend Jones was going to jump in there
Okay.
too. Sorry.
Yeah, go. I'm sorry.
I just want to add to this in terms of, I'm thinking about this kind of idea that nobody is free until everybody is free, right? That we've known for a long time, and this sense that if our vision for justice, for wholeness, for equality does not include equality and this sense of an entire community being whole and set free, from women to gender nonconforming to trans identified to a multiplicity of Blackness and Black identities, then we won't reach, I think, where we're trying to go. And so I am interested in the church thinking about its mission and understanding of its role in the world to be that of a resource to activists and protesters and to folks who are on the front lines for us, even if it is not leading the charge. It reminds us or helps us to think about our own arrogancy or our own insistence that we must always be in the lead, rather than, again, I like what Reverend Lamar has pointed to, rather than being this guest and making space and resources available for those who are on the front lines. And I also want to bring us back to the liturgical witness of the church, right? How can we make requiems for the dead? How can we make space for there to be lament, for there to be mourning and grieving? How can we open ourselves in ways that heals our community at a multiplicity of levels, even as we fight against the powers that be?
Yeah.
Very quickly, Dr. King talks about in some of his sermonic essays, as well as some of his lectures, the importance of strategic partnerships for particular kinds of ends. And I do think that there is, for those who may be concerned, I mean, in a space like this, about the kind of Christian identity and what that looks like in those spaces, I think there's quite a bit of resources that can be mined in Christian tradition to see how this is certainly right-headed. I think what many of us are suggesting. I'm thinking about even something like Jeremiah 29, right? When he talks about seeking the peace or the prosperity of the shalom of the city, right? This is when they were in exile, right? They were sent into exile, and basically they were being called to settle in and settle down because they're going to be there for a while. And while you're there, seek the peace of the city, join with those who are around you, build houses, promote that prosperity, right? And then God gave promises to the people of God for that covenant faithfulness in light of their new reality. And so I just think that we can think about these issues in terms of God's overall common grace and what God is doing in the world. And how can the church, in this sense, be the hands and the feet of Jesus, as Jesus didn't often hang out with the religious authorities and the leaders, but Jesus was amongst the people as they were, as they are, right? And obviously, he was the epitome of what a vision of humanity should be in terms of that movement. But that's a different kind of topic there. So.
Yeah. Well, and of course, the biblical witness of God using people who did not worship God to, help his own people get free from somebody else, and so you just look at how God's ways are always baffling to us. The more we try to put God in a box, the more we realize that we're really just looking at a reflection of ourselves. So I definitely appreciate everything that you all are saying. So let's go to this, notion of minding the tradition. In light of the rich spiritual traditions of the Black church, let's think constructively now. How do Black pastors need to think about preaching and teaching and discipleship as we think about this moment? Certainly, it's not a new moment, but it's a unique moment. And in order to build communities that are spiritually and emotionally and intellectually ready for the work that you all have just described. I mean, what does leadership look like? What does ministry call us to do? Are we talking about, and I'm being sarcastic, more fish fries? I think not, but what are we talking about? Yeah. What do we need to do? I mean, what are we seeing out there that you really respect and admire? Anybody want to weigh in on that?
Yeah.
I think that I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I think that historically, the Black church has, when it is at its best, is focused on three things.
Okay.
And one is personal transformation. You cannot have a good tossed salad with spoiled ingredients. So having a moral compass for Black people that is rooted in our traditions is critically important. By personal transformation, I mean values such as courage. And what does courage mean? When you're Martin Luther King and you know that death is imminent. So I think the personal transformation and giving people a moral compass that prioritizes the group is a part of the mission of the Black church, which means we have to redo our Sunday school and Bible studies in light of that. Secondly is social justice. What we've been talking about. The church must be actively engaged in social justice, righting the wrongs, advancing the cause of reparations, dealing with issues such as mass incarceration and things such as this, equity. It was, we think it was the police that killed, and they did pull the trigger. I mean, they did kill George Floyd, but in a sense, he was dead by other factors before the police. And that was policies, politicians. He was poor. He was in a poor school. That's before the police got to him. I think it's interesting that when you think of the word Minneapolis, that the Greek word polis means city. And 5 words emanate from that word polis. And that is politicians and policies and politics and police and polls. Blacks who did not go to the polls to promote justice are just as guilty as the police who have their neck, their foot on his neck. So we have to have personal transformation, social justice, and then finally group empowerment, which is economic empowerment. We don't trade with each other. We don't build businesses with each other. And I think that is that somebody mentioned Vernon Johns. You know, he offended the bourgeoisie sensibilities of the Dexter Avenue folk by not wearing shoestrings in his shoes on Sunday. And when they asked him, well, Dr. Johns, when are you going to wear some shoestrings in your shoes? He says, I'll start wearing shoestrings when Negroes start manufacturing and selling shoestrings. So the fact of the matter is that we are a colony. We're not just a ghetto. We're a colony. We're a get colony because we don't control, and as Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture said, we don't control the economics, the politics, and the education of our communities. So I think the agenda of the Black church must be those 3 things: personal transformation, social justice, and group empowerment.
Thanks. That's great.
Amen.
Yeah.
I think this is an important question. And I think for me, the question of what is the role of the church is so intricately linked to the question of what is the role or the person of the pastor in times like these. Let's not forget that we're in the midst of the coronavirus, that for the past almost 4 months, pastors have had to reinvent themselves in ways they never expected. There was such a grieving in the beginning of this period of pastors who were used to having an exchange with the congregation, even in the preaching moment, that it was a dance, it was a call and response, it was an I see you and you see me. And in this new era, pastors have had to re-identify who they are. When you consider this, I believe, beautiful opportunity that God has given us to define ourselves, I think the question starts with the pastor. Who are you? What is your role? Where do you need to beef up your education or your experience or your context so that you can lead people well? I think Pastor Cosby has given such a great view of what it looks like to have activism. And that to me also ties with this idea of discipleship. What does it look like to follow Jesus now? Jesus who sits with the sinners and tax collectors. Jesus who was always in the street, always. What does that look like now? I just saw a study that said that people have really stopped engaging in relationships with churches, that a lot of people have stopped attending church in the traditional ways, not watching church, and those who are watching 8 different pastors. So what does it mean now that we know what church looks like now? How do we build on this to have some type of collective identity that hopefully stems with an internal awareness of a pastor who says, here's where I know I'm called. A lot of this is calling. What's the calling of your church? Here's where I feel called, and here's where I know I can lead my congregation. And the beautiful thing about something like this is, who else can I invite onto my platform that can help and shape this collective consciousness with me? If I know I'm not strong in a particular area, how can I call some of these scholars to help build up and disciple my people to do all that God has called them to do and to be?
All right. So the whole notion of leadership is key, and who's the leader? How are they developing themselves? Let me hear from others of you. I mean, what does this look like in terms of ministry, in terms of discipleship, in terms of what's happening in the life of the church?
I am thinking about as a kind of way of thinking about this, not only critically of our own politics. And one of the ways that I think that organizers and activists have been responding negatively to the church's response to some of our current issues is mainly because many of our actions are hypocritical to our own kind of intra-politics, that we have been seeking justice out there or justice beyond, but haven't looked at who we're hiring, right? Who is leading in worship? Who are the marginalized? Who doesn't have a seat at the table? Who are the voices that are missing, even as we gather, right? Even as we gather in our own sacred spaces, often excluding and not including certain people and voices and certain ideas. And so I think that as we seek justice out there, we have to think very critically about what models of justice are we representing within our local gatherings or assemblies, but also in some of our broader assemblies. I think this question that Dr. Nicole mentioned in terms of strategic partnership is key. We are on the front lines of every cause. It is hunger, it is food, it is health, right? It is race, it is gender and sexuality, it is housing, right? We are at a multiplicity and a multi-dimensionality of issues and plights. Thus, we need to be partnering with clinical health professionals. We need to be partnering with folks who are trained and have particular expertises and skills that can resource our churches. And then lastly, I think that we need to be challenges of the systems, not just kind of curers of the symptoms, right? So yes, your coat drive is a good deed, right? But how does it speak to a system that continually ensures that people are marginalized by certain weather disasters, right? How does it continually ensure that environmental protection is not made for those in certain communities? How are we challenging those systems and not just kind of curing the symptoms?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I talk about, I think about that as the difference between sort of charity and philanthropy. Charity, the Band-Aid it may be needed in the moment. And then how are we going to invest so that we can change the structure of what led to the problem in the first place? And churches tend to major in charity. And over the years, we have done very little on the philanthropic investment side. Some we didn't have the resources, but also I think now is the time to think about having the imagination as well. Thank you, Reverend Jones. Dr. Smith?
It's interesting now following Reverend Jones, right? I was like, anything else is going to be downhill from that, at least for me in that respect. So earlier, like ditto, with respect to what you just said, very well said here. I would just say kind of two things that are not necessarily, they're related in the bigger picture. One is kind of a more academic kind of aspect, being in the role that I'm in, but I do think the education piece in terms of discipleship becomes important. And so, just in conversation with one of the questions that was on the panel, but also just in thinking about how to recapture the prophetic witness of the Black church that has been infiltrated by, I think, a lot of different frames of reference that have been informed by notions of white supremacy. Kamara Jones wrote this piece years ago called talking about the three levels of racism. And, of course, there's the institutional, aspect in terms of how racism plays itself out institutionally, interpersonally, but then also in terms of how with people, but also internalization, right? And so one of the things we have to continue to work at is the internalization of white supremacy amongst so many Black folks in our country through various ways of being socialized, and that's a serious challenge that we have to wrestle with. And so this is one of the things where Pastor Rivers, I've been an advocate of. Man, we need to figure out a way to go back to the tradition. And I know that word tradition could be a very troubling word for some, especially because of all of the harms that groups, people, organizations have done in the name of tradition. But I'm thinking of it more in the Latin sense of the term traduco, to carry over. That which was carried over. There have been resources that have sustained us through very difficult times and continue to nurture generation to generation going back mining those aspects of that which is being carried over, but then to bring in that Protestant heritage a little bit, always reforming, right? But we're using those resources to always continue reforming in the moment where we are so that we can continue to go forward. And then lastly, so that's kind of the educational piece, but then I would say that all of our discipleship has to be incarnational, right? So this is where, again, the person of Jesus becomes so, I think, central for our thinking about this, looking at Jesus, who is the image of God. And the scriptures say that all other human beings have been made according to that image. So now Jesus becomes the epitome of what it means for us to be human. And how do we leverage that in terms of going forward? That means living the kind of faith that Jesus lived before us, and that radically changes it from a kind of abstract theological framework that many of our pastors are being trained in.
Yeah, this has been extraordinarily nourishing. What I think about Pastor Rivers is the cross. So the only way we've been taught to read the cross is through the lens of substitutionary atonement. Mm-hmm. That Jesus died, we're saved, we're rescued, penalty's been paid. Well, if you go through theological history, there have been multiple ways of viewing the cross, and substitutionary atonement had been rejected, has been reformed. There's a whole lot of ideas. I think that what we must do is to see the cross as God's solidarity with the crucified people in Washington, in Durham, in Louisville, in Lesotho, and God's solidarity with these people, meaning that I will live among you and suffer the consequence of living as someone of God, sent by God with you, shows the church what our discipleship has to look like. So you think about the miracles of Jesus healing. The church has not only feed, but as was mentioned by Reverend Melanie, we have to understand that the people needed to be fed because of what imperialism had done to them, because of what debt prison had done to them. The healing, people needed to be healed because their bodies were broken and bruised, and at every moment, God was interceding, God was pressing. And so what I've shared with the church is Detroit manufactures cars, Hollywood manufactures lies, Washington, D.C. manufactures crosses. What we have to do is to take people down from crosses, and our devotional lives have to be centered around that same solidarity incarnate and made visible in the ministry of Jesus. Finally, this, and man, this blew my mind because I had read passages in scripture. In John, they decided that they were gonna kill Jesus after he raised Lazarus from the dead. They were clear that anybody with the power of life was dangerous because the only tool they had was a tool of death. Now watch this. Pastor Cosby talking about this. Not educating people is death. Not offering health care is death. Not offering people safe housing is death. If we could ever understand that we have the power of life, that we can follow Jesus even unto our own crosses, and God will not allow the gospel to die, we could do incredible things. And so the church ought to be moving toward these markers of God's reign in the world. Guaranteed income, guaranteed health care, guaranteed safe housing, and making sure that human beings have everything they need to flourish. We can do it. I hope y'all join the Poor People's campaign tomorrow, 10 a.m., broadcast around the country. $53 of every dollar you send to Uncle Sam is spent on the war economy. We can do it. We've got to build toward that vision of solidarity. And it just excites me about what's possible if we hold on to that.
I tell you, this is great. I got about 20 sermons and about another 10 panel ideas. So, I mean, you all have really just said some very profound things. I'm looking at some of the chats that are coming up, and people have really been blessed by what you're saying. Just a couple of questions as we think about transitioning out. One, just want to thank you for being here. What does the posture of protest look like beyond this moment? What I think what's happening is very important, and maybe it's what you've just said, and that's fine. But we also know that it's this and, it's this and so what's the and, if you could say what you want to see happening in a church, what's the and? Doc, unmute yourself, Dr. Cosby.
Can I address this quickly? And
yeah,
that what made the civil rights movement possible was television. When Bloody Sunday took place, the very Sunday that the movie Nuremberg was being aired, and they interrupted the movie of Nuremberg about the war criminals, the Nazis, to show American Nazis beating peaceful protesters crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. It would have been impossible to even do the civil rights struggle without it. It would be impossible for us to experience the present moment of revolt if it were not for cameras, social media, and podcasts like this. Mm-hmm. What I hope we will do to sustain it, because you cannot sustain this if you do not reconstitute some basic institutions in the Black community. One is we have got to reconstitute just what you're doing, Dr. Rivers, and that is Black controlled media. We need a new Black media that is helping the Black community to see reality through a Black lens. And that is the reason why I do not think that this is this is truly something transformative in America. And I think it has to do with the new Black media that has emerged on through podcasts like this. So we have to reconstitute the basic institutions of our community. We became deinstitutionalized as a result of integration. We went from segregation to desegregation to integration to disintegration because the Black professionals got co-opted into white controlled space, leaving the Black masses without leaders. So we've got to rebuild our own institutions. We have to rebuild Black colleges. I'm the president of an HBCU. We need our Black colleges, our Black schools, Black institutions, Black media, Black schools, Black businesses, Black churches, and strong Black families. I hope that that's the direction in which we will go.
Excellent, excellent. Anybody else? Yeah.
I agree with Reverend Lamar. Jesus died so we don't have to. And I think that the biblical tradition gives us not only some examples of protests, but about the need to resist the social order. As a Baptist, I'm thinking about John the Baptizer, who was this rogue, radical, and unruly figure who defied the Roman imperial order by not being seduced by its appearance and appetite. He was a wilderness dweller, wearing camel's hair on his back, a leather belt around his waist, and fasting on a diet of locusts and honey. And I believe that in order for us to think about protests, that not only is resistance something we should be a part of, but that it is something that is already laid out for us in the biblical tradition as the order or the powers that be of the day are not meant to produce our flourishing or survival. And so we need to resist until that inbreaking of God's reign comes to pass.
Amen. Yeah.
Yeah, I hope that those who are participating today hear this. We are talking about reframing the gospel. And this is the moment, this is the opportunity that many people need to take advantage of. I grew up in a very pietistic Black Baptist church. I'm now a part of an AME church. And there is a part of AM history and legacy that I'm just now getting to know that has helped me reshape and redefine what the cross is all about and what my legacy and my lineage is all about. And I think we can't continue the protest if it's an external work. We can continue if we are willing to have a reshaping, a redefinition that happens on the inside that flows on the outside. And honestly, that comes from conversations like these, that comes from exposure to theologians like Howard Thurman, that comes from understanding that suffering, according to Thurman, is a spiritual discipline. I mean, it comes from this understanding of taking on a cross, but not so that you would, be in this individualistic, I keep going back to the, if you were to die today, Lord Jesus, please don't let Pastor Lamar take my ordination. But I feel like these conversations are happening in small pockets. And what we need to do is help reshape a mindset of Black people who have held on to a gospel that was very whitewashed and need to be delivered and released from that to be able to take on new mindsets that will help them to keep the momentum. And then it becomes less of an action in what I do and more of an understanding of identity of who I really am.
Wow.
That's great.
And I'll say real quickly before I make my statement here, when Dr. Cosby was giving his example about the conversion in the car, I was wondering about what kind of car it was, right, in terms of how I would respond on that Wednesday, though. So I was a bit tempted with respect to that. But I would say this whole idea in terms of relationship, a way that we can continue to resist beyond the public outcry, in addition to that public outcry, is, since we're talking about racial justice, those 3 points that I mentioned, earlier about the institutional aspect, interpersonal, as well as the internalization, and how can we begin to continue to resist in all of those ways. And so 2 things I would say, just in addition to my agreement with what else has already been said. The first is I was thinking about Carter G. Woodson's, classic book, The Miseducation of the Negro, right? In terms of thinking about our minds, right? Resisting this kind of internalization. So this is a form of protest, right? Always resisting to have the kind of existential freedom, right, and social freedom that I raised a few moments ago in terms of Cornel West's essay that comes through there. And I think that becomes really important. But then also for us thinking about this relationship of how our faith informs our work, right? So on our jobs in different ways, we can begin to kind of resist these issues by looking at the sphere of influence where I live, where I move, where I have my being, and how can I make a change, or how can I invoke influence based on where I am and the power and the agency in which I have. So I think it's just this ongoing mindset of always kind of resisting, whether we see it interpersonally, institutional, and also the internalization piece as well.
Amen. Nothing to add. It's been stated beautifully.
And that's what I'll say. Look, you all have just really, really blessed us. So grateful for the time that you've invested tonight. I did see one of the questions that came up about, this is going to be an ongoing conversation. To Dr. Cosby's point about Black media, this has to be an ongoing conversation. I hope you will come back when we extend an invitation as we think about this some more. And maybe we can start out with questions from our listeners as a way to get them involved. But I know you all have had a long week, a long day. For many of you, the day and the week is not over. And so we just pray God's blessings on each of you. And thank you for speaking truth that we needed to hear tonight. And we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Patrick Smith, Reverend Melanie Jones, Reverend Dr. Kevin Cosby, Reverend William Lamar, and Dr. Nicole Martin. Grateful for all of you. God's blessings. Again, everyone is watching this. You can see the recording of this on Union Baptist Church's YouTube channel. And follow all of these folks on social media. Check them out and just support them in all that they do. Look forward to seeing you all again very soon. And I pray you have a great evening and a blessed weekend.
Thank you.
God bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.